Okay, we'll start then. Good afternoon to you all and a very warm welcome. I'm Janice Goldstraw-White, one of Martin Gill's colleagues at Perpetuity, and I'll be chairing today's session. And as we know, today is actually our 190th Thought Leadership webinar, and today's topic is taking sustainability seriously. How common is greenwashing and what can we do about it? As many as you know, we're here every week, or every other week, usually on a Thursday afternoon, examining a topic of central importance to the prevention of crime. And the idea of these thought leadership webinars is that we critique today in order to gain a better type of prevention for tomorrow. It's not really our intention to try and solve all the world's issues today in one session. More, we're trying to encourage new thinking and ideas and to debate what's going on, to put forward different perspectives to change current practices. And a copy of this webinar will be put on the website tomorrow, like all our other previous 189, so it can be referred to in the future. We know a lot of people also tune in and look at the webinar after it's gone live. All right, and on today's topic then, as we all know, it's good business to be seen to be supporting the green agenda. And certainly bad news follows or is likely to follow an organisation that's not committed to this. But how will we know if they're really following the green agenda? Do security professionals really care about this? And if so, how is that reflected in their work and everyday life? The environmental, social and corporate governance, what we know as the ECG concept, is becoming more and more well known. But in what ways is this seen and how are the barriers, what are the barriers to embedding this in security practice? Therefore, at the end of this webinar, we hope to have discussed the extent and nature of greenwashing in terms of sustainability, the routes of developing meaningful measures of sustainability and or for ECG, and the potential of the security sector to set a good example in this. So today we're going to hear from two experts who both have immense experience in this area, and therefore we look to hearing what they've got to say, their thoughts on this topic. So without further ado, what I'm going to do in a moment is invite the first of our two panelists to introduce themselves, and once they've done that, I'll ask them to make their opening statements. It's going to be a few minutes when they get to say whatever they want to on this topic, and after that we'll turn to you, the audience, to ask your questions. So can I encourage you to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and please try and get your questions in early, and I'll endeavour as always to include as many as I can in the ensuing discussion. So without any further delay then, let's go and meet our panel. First, let's go to Russel. Russel, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Janice, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Russel Kerr. I'm the Managing Director at SecuriGroup. I've been involved with the private security industry for over 25 years. I've witnessed lots of changes and lots of developments. My organisation focuses primarily on the provision of security personnel, coupled with technical solutions, and we have a cyber security arm to the business as well. I'm a regional chair of the British Security Industry Association, and I co-chair one of the CSSC hubs in the UK, and I'm an active member of the Security Institute, and I recently joined member of the Worshipful Company of Security Professionals, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much, Russell. All right, we'll go over to you now, Michael. Some of you may know Michael from previous webinars, but Michael, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Janice. Good morning from Washington, D.C. Again, Michael Gips. I'm the principal of Global Insights in Professional Security, a security consulting firm that provides thought leadership, branding, business development. Yes, I've been on this webinar many times. I've hosted it once. It's a great pleasure and an honor. I've been honored to have received the, you see behind my right shoulder, I think it's my right shoulder as you're looking at me, an OSPA from a couple of years ago for U.S. security consultant. I've worked in the industry for almost 30 years, much of it with ASIS as the publisher and editor of Security Management Magazine, the creator of the CSO Roundtable, now the CSO Center for Leadership and Development, and the head of learning, knowledge, content, marketing, membership, standards and guidelines, and certification. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure, Michael. Right, well, in a moment, I'm just going to go to our panelists again in the same order to make their opening statements. But just can I remind you, the audience, please submit your questions through the question and answer button, and we'll include as many as we can. Okay, if I can go over to you now, Russell. Russell, can we have your opening statement, please?
Sure, thanks. So SecuriGroup is a private security business, and we employ over 3,000 excellent people across the UK and Ireland. We're an award-winning business and a plethora of accreditations, ISO 9001, 45001, and many more. We're an investor in people organisation, and as you would expect, we're an SIA-approved contractor, and our near maximum score places us at the pinnacle of that top 1% category. And I mentioned earlier that I've witnessed lots of changes, because a key focus for our organisation now is the environment, and in particular, what we can do to reduce our impact on the planet, and how we can do more for the communities that we serve. And both of these points support our core purpose, which is to strengthen society. Environment has always been a big one for me. I graduated from university with an environmental science degree. My family and I have always done what we can to reduce our impact on the environment, and I wanted the business to do the same. The United Nations Climate Conference, COP26, was held in the UK in late 2021. And for me, that was a real call to action. I wanted the business to be carbon neutral before COP26 conference opened its doors. And in the year leading up to that, as a business, we made some quite fundamental changes. We transferred all of our energy provision across our office estate to renewable sources. We replaced our lighting and our heating with energy efficient systems. Our cloud computing infrastructure, our web hosting, is now provided by green certified providers. We've been developing over a number of years a mobile app which helps to digitize processes so that we're almost 100% paperless. And we're currently transitioning our mobile vehicle fleet to electric or hybrid by 2025. But for the carbon that we've not yet been able to reduce, we've invested heavily in United Nations carbon credits, which, as you would imagine, supports the UN sustainability goals. But we don't want to be reliant on these credits forever, and we're continually working to reduce those carbon emissions. In fact, we've reduced our emissions every year since becoming carbon neutral. We wanted to take some direct action too, so we planted our own woodland here in the UK. We planted over 2,000 indigenous species. That scheme has now been credited by the Woodland Carbon Code. It's listed on the global register, and we use those units to offset directly some of our activity now. This is probably one of the things that I'm most proud of, because it's tangible. It's not about paying for or towards an unseen wind farm off the coast of China, or a conservation project deep in the Amazon. We can visit our woodland, we can touch it, we can watch it grow. So that, alongside some of those other measures that we had introduced prior to COP26, allowed us to become carbon neutral on target ahead of COP26. And I'm really proud of the progress and the start that we've made. But I guess what frustrates me, and why I was interested in participating to this seminar in particular, was how do we compete with all of the businesses out there that say that they're carbon net zero or carbon neutral? How do we differentiate ourselves from the crowd? And most importantly, how do we prove our green credentials? So back to you, Janice. That's my next step.
Okay, thank you. Enough for us to unpack later there then. Once again, just to remind you, send your questions in. I'll include as many as I can. Now, if I can hand over to you, Michael. Michael, can we have your opening statement, please?
Sure. Thanks, Janice. First, I'd like to commend Russell for what sounds like an exemplary ESG effort. Frankly, I don't hear about too much of those, so it's going to be interesting to me to hear how Russel is trying to find, and his company is trying to find a place to distinguish himself in the marketplace in ESG with this competition. Because over here, at least in the United States, I think security's track record with ESG is spotty at best. So I'm going to start with the case for ESG. It's pretty clear, but as McKinsey states it, the overwhelming weight of accumulated research finds that companies that pay attention to ESG concerns do not experience a drag on value creation. In fact, quite the opposite. A strong ESG correlates with higher equity returns. Better performance in ESG also corresponds with a reduction in downside risk, as evidenced, among other ways, by lower loan and credit default swap spreads and higher credit ratings. So we're talking now about ESG investing as opposed to ESG as a general societal good. My issue with ESG, and I mean, I think it's commendable and worthy, is that it's too big and all-encompassing. I'll just sit down here and I can talk about it more later, is that somebody put a whole bunch of important initiatives and lumped them together and called them ESG. These are initiatives that on their own are individually extremely important. They're under an expansive rubric. So consider what ESG covers. Environment alone covers climate change, carbon footprint, air and water pollution, depletion of natural resources, energy use, waste management, and so on. Then you get to social or societal issues, and you're putting in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a whole huge area of concern and a whole initiative, corporate initiative outright. Health and safety issues, community relations, fair labor practices, human rights, living wages, customer satisfaction, and on and on. Now let's add governance to that. Governance, internal leadership, board composition and duties, business integrity, data privacy and cybersecurity, risk management, corruption and bribery, whistleblowing, workplace investigations, regulatory compliance. That bucket itself, the governance bucket itself, includes a lot of the entire security and risk management functions. So in short, ESG is a catch-all that we can't possibly treat holistically, in my opinion. No one really owns it. No one can own the whole thing. It's been grafted onto the body corporate. I will get into sort of more of the detail. I can say to the extent that security is doing well in ESG, it's on the governance side. And that's not a surprise because governance contains typical security and risk management functions. And it also includes functions that are mandated by law. As for environmental and social issues, we're not in security, we're not really moving the needle, or our successes are merely situational. Governance, as I said, is regulated in many industries and pretty much standardized across business. So there are best practices. With social and environmental initiatives, they're on shakier ground. I think the sense is with security being a relatively small industry and with very few large corporations in security, the thought is like, well, what can I do about it? I will, I kind of disappear into the bushes. I'm just a small business. No one's really watching anyway. So and then I'll get into some issues of in the United States, ESG is now being considered woke. So it's not in the United States, at least, and I'm sure around the rest of the world, it's not ESG is not considered an unqualified good. I'll get into that later, but these are some of the issues I see that are hampering ESG today. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Certainly provided us with enough information there to come back with some questions. I'll just remind everybody, if you want to submit any questions, please do. I think I'll start off with perhaps asking Russell, given what you've heard, I'm interested to know if there's any sort of differences within countries, and obviously we're representing the the UK and the US here, so specifically in the areas that you know about. Russell, given the detail that Michael went into there about the US, is there any observable differences or things that you say, yeah, that's just the same in the UK, that you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, I liked Michael's terminology around it being spotty, and I think that's probably the same as it is here. There are organisations that I think have really put their shoulder to the wheel and are leading the charge on ESG, and I know that there is, as Michael points out, there's a lot for us to do, but I think it is probably similar. I hear lots of companies talking about it, but I hear I see other companies not mentioning it at all. So I think that's probably fair.
I was reading something earlier, and probably Michael's already alluded to it, that I was going to ask you about. Is, as I say, it's in some ways it's three diverse sort of things brought together under ESG. Is there any particular element of that you think is getting less attention? I think you said, Michael, that obviously governance you felt was stronger. Does either of you want to sort of comment on that?
Well, I can say that when people, at least in my experience, when people talk about ESG, they almost inevitably go to the environmental factors, which are incredibly important, right? You think ESG and it's like, climate change, it's wasting of resources. And, to a lesser extent, sort of social issues, crime and poverty and things like that. And then the governance, it's like, is almost an afterthought in this, which is maybe why, governance is doing, it's sort of, okay, we had the baseline, governance has always existed. Corporate governance is part of, of every organizational structure. It's mandated. And so, okay, you've got that in the background, and then you're adding on environmental and social. Again, it just goes to my point that I think there's too many things grafted together that are, it's almost like someone took the term corporate social responsibility and then pulled all the elements out of it and said, okay, here are the elements of corporate social responsibility, but there's nobody responsible for all those things in a company. And it wouldn't report up to a single person. It covers the entire enterprise. So I don't know if that answers the question, but when I think of ESG, when I see other people talking about it, it tends to be on the environmental side, and how can we take care of that, and to the exclusion or not even consideration of the other two factors, social and governance.
Would you agree with Michael on that, Russell?
Yeah, I think the corporate governance for credible organizations has always been there. The risk management, the compliance, the ethical business practices. And I've seen lots of webinars coming through recently focusing on the S of ESG, because I think the environmental aspect to ESG has been quite widely trailed. But there is a lot of work to be done, I think, in all aspects. And there are some overlaps and interlinkages, the ethical business practices linking in with some of that social value, and then on the social value linking into the environmental, because I also think that the environment is important to the people that work within our businesses as well. It's very much at the forefront when we're doing recruitment and so on. It's important. It's important for everybody. So while there are some distinctions, I think there are some overlaps, and there are some threads which link the three together. But yeah, you're right. Environment has for a long time hogged the priority. Governance has always been there, and I'm seeing much more on the social value side of the ESG coming to the fore.
Yeah, and then you've summed it up perfectly. It's exactly what I read this morning in terms of, you know, governance, like you say, it's been there all the time. You've got, although, and it seems that the governance one, probably of the three, to me, seems a little bit different because it's probably quite inward looking, whereas the other two are very much outward looking factors. But as you say, you know, we've probably had good governance now from the 80s and 90s, and that is well established. I've got to say, an area of its own, it doesn't necessarily attract one person looking after that, let alone to put that in with two other elements. And I think when you start talking about sustainability and the green agenda and ECG, you automatically start to think environmental. So I think that's had a lot of attention there. So I suppose it is the social responsibility. And I suppose that comes back to something I said at the beginning in terms of, you know, what do we mean by social responsibility then? Would you like to comment on that, either of you or both of you?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on the social. I mean, for me, I think Michael had already touched on the living wage and fair pay, staff benefits, fair pay and conditions, workplace health and safety, because that's really important. There's making sure that there's a positive culture, which is engendering good behaviours across the organisation to make it a good place to come to work. There's human rights and modern slavery, ensuring that we're looking at our supply chains to ensure that there is we're eliminating labour exploitation in the supply chain. And then you've got that whole body of work, which is another subset around equality, diversity, inclusion. And really it's about being a socially just employer. That's the S in ESG for me.
Yeah, that was beautifully articulated by Russell. I will say that among those social factors, what I'm seeing a lot of is mindfulness towards human trafficking. A lot of companies are becoming aware of how they impact the human trafficking market, not just hotels where people might be kept, or airlines or bus companies, but anyone with any business that can, you know, that has any sort of impact at all. It could be retail, it could be manufacturing, and you wouldn't realize what kind of involvement they have. They don't realize until it's pointed out to them, but there's much more awareness now. And the other pillar is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, as I said earlier, is its own enormous category that is now also lumped in ESG. And I would also say that there's a lot of accusations that DE&I is performative and that it hasn't really worked. And you know, people would say the same thing about ESG. I think DE&I has taken a little bit of a hit because, at least in the United States, the underpinnings of saying that diversity, equity, inclusion is an absolute good, or diversity of race, background, thought is an absolute good, took a little bit of a hit with a recent U.S. Supreme Court justice opinion that said Harvard can't and other universities can't use race as a factor in determining who gets into, you know, who they accept into their schools. So when you can't consider race, that's a significant part of DE&I efforts. And it sort of sends mixed signals. So there's that kind of pushback from the highest court in the land. So, you know, I find that interesting, and that the issue isn't getting any easier.
I think one of the things that Russell mentioned that I was going to ask a question about later, so I might as well ask it now, was how far, certainly in the security industry, and probably generally across other industries as well, in terms of ECG, are we actually sort of considering this wider picture? You mentioned there, Russell, about, you know, the supply chain. How seriously are organisations looking at the sort of full impact of everything they do, you know, rather than saying, you know, we're particularly green in this area, but then they're not admitting the green in other areas. They're sort of cherry picking which bits they want to talk about, but also looking through, you know, from the sourcing their material through to selling, etc., within that whole supply chain. How well are we getting developed in sustainability there?
Well, I think we're being led by some of our clients who clearly take this very seriously. And as a result, I think any successful business has to listen to what their clients take seriously. So, we're definitely switched on to our own supply chains to make sure that they are sustainable. But, we need to look out for the organizations out there, and this is where, the topic today around greenwashing and about those that are using clever marketing to make it sound as though that they are either green or socially just. And I've seen in particular greenwashing being a term leveled at a broad range of organizations across the full spectrum. At one end, those that are unscrupulous organizations that are using disinformation, creative advertising, or PR to tell us that they are environmentally friendly or socially just. And then there's those at the other end, which are organizations which are, in this case, probably carbon emitters, net carbon emitters, but they have introduced programs and initiatives to reduce their emissions. And they're often tarred with the same greenwash brush, which I think is a bit unfair, because I actually think those that I described in the latter are taking a welcome step in the right direction, recognizing that they've got work to do. And while they're emitting, that they are also looking at some more green, sustainable activity to help either offset that or replace the activity which is burdening the environment.
You want to make any comments on that, Michael?
Yeah, I'd like to actually turn it more to the social factor. Russell was talking more about environmental, and he had good comments. I would only add that organizations often look to what their governments are doing and follow suit, or at least look at it as a guideline, and then sort of make a business/political statement from there. And one thing example I'm thinking of is when President Biden issued an order saying that, and I can't remember the extent or the nature of the order, but it was about dealing with buying Chinese goods from a particular province in, I forget the name of the province, in China, where the Uyghurs are being exploited, their human rights abuses that were being levied against the Uyghurs. And there are a lot of global companies that are doing business there. I'm not going to name the companies, but there's a lot of manufacturing of apparel that happens there. And these companies had to decide, they produce things for very cheaply in the Chinese market and sell it back around the world. And when you have the president of the United States saying, thou shalt not do business in these areas because of the way these people are being treated, it sends a big signal to businesses around the world. It's like, okay, I have to draw the line in the sand right now. So am I going to go with that? Even if it's not binding, if you're a European company and the US president says certainly not binding on you, but you now have to create an identity and say, okay, I'm going to go along with that principle, or I'm going to defy it for the sake of my shareholders, because do the shareholders really care about the Uyghurs, or do they care about, their returns or the value of their investment? So it creates an imperative to stake your place in the economic and political environment.
No, and I agree with you. There are certain tensions within organisations that conflicting, and I think one of the ones I always sort of thinking about as well is, in fairness, the sort of PR sections of organisations have particular targets and objectives to meet, and sometimes they're working in a silo away from those sort of responsible for sustainability. And I don't think those always go together in an organisation. I don't know if either of you want to sort of comment on that.
I actually wanted to circle back. I'll leave that to Russell. I wanted to circle back to something that you had asked him before about the difference between US and UK or
Sure.
anywhere else for that matter. And it's not so much the difference, but when I was looking through this issue, I was thinking about the issue and who the advocates are. And I couldn't think of one American person. I've been in, and I'm sure there are. So if I don't mean to besmirch anyone's reputation or say there aren't these great advocates. I'm sure there are. It's just no Americans came to mind as someone who really like hold the mantle for ESG. But one Brit did, and it's James Morris, who I consider the Lorax of security. I don't know if you remember the Dr. Seuss book. I think it's actually behind me, the Lorax of security. He's sort of the conscience of environmental consciousness, and passion like that is indispensable for our profession and our industry. But it's an outlier. Security businesses that are founded on ESG principles struggle. So if solar power costs a penny more than electric power, the industry bows to the bottom line and goes for the cheaper alternative, even if it takes a larger toll on the world in the long run. But I really wanted to point out that even though I can't speak to the general differences, I just want to call it James Morris as being sort of the conscious, the Lorax of ESG for the security industry.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I'll just remind the audience, if you've got any questions, please send them in. I've actually got one, excuse me, at the moment from one of our regular attendees from Glen Kittingham. And basically what he's saying is, there's growing conflict between fundamental democracy and good governance. And security personnel are much like law enforcement at the moment. He feels are walking a fine line between enforcing unjust laws, which are nonetheless. So he firmly believes that the enforcement agents are going to have to make a decision soon, that they're either on the side of democracy or on the side of government. The questions he asked then is, do you agree or disagree with this statement? And have you got any advice on how to negotiate this within the security industry?
Which is quite a departure from environment and social. I don't have any particular views on that one. I think for me, just going back to your previous point about PR and how sometimes that's used against us or to manipulate us. I mean, there are greenwashing accusations, as I've touched on before. But we need to be realistic about there is an increasing demand for hydrocarbons, and that will continue across the globe. And I think for us, it's there needs to be a just and fair, sensible transition away from fossil fuels. But that's going to take time. Indeed.
Michael, do you have any comments?
I think Russell was wise to sidestep that question. That sounds like a little bit of a trap question. I know Glenn very well. I will say that businesses will do, they'll comply with regulations, with legal requirements, but their responsibility is to their board, to their shareholders, to their owners, and they will do what's in the best interest. So without getting into the politics of it, they will continue to walk the line being compliant and doing what's best for their business, and wherever that puts them on the ESG spectrum or the DE&I spectrum.
You talked about there about regulations. That was one sort of area I wanted to talk about to both of you, really, because what we were saying was in the opening is really, how do we actually measure this? How do we measure this? And I suppose the first thing that came to my mind is, well, what are the regulations? Are there any particular regulations in the UK? Are they different to the US in any way? Do either of you want to sort of tell the audience a little bit more about that?
Is that in relation to carbon neutrality or net?
Yeah, to sustainability issues generally, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the issues, is that it's quite unregulated. And one of the points I made in my opening statements was we're doing all these things, but how do we differentiate ourselves from those that are maybe manipulating the PR to make it sound better than it actually is? We've always gone for external verification. I think it's always more credible to be able to say that an external body has approved, certified, or accredited. And one of the key things that we wanted to do when we were on our carbon neutrality journey was not to be able to make these statements and comments, to talk about our green credentials, but also point to an accreditation. And we found there's an international standard for carbon neutrality, which is PAS 2060. And we were very fortunate as an organisation to be part of the first UK pilot of that. And timing is everything, because we were working very hard towards that. And we literally were awarded our PAS 2060 accreditation the week of COP26. So timing was absolutely perfect there. But my advice to anyone would be, especially within the sustainability space, is to look for standards which are recognizable, like ISO 14001. Look at engaging with the carbon reduction community and be ready for scrutiny. Because we need to be accountable for the statements that we make. SecuriGroup was one of the first 100 companies to sign up to the climate pledge, and we found ourselves on a list alongside Microsoft, Coca-Cola, Amazon, which was a fantastic achievement for us. And we've committed to Science-Based Targets Initiative. We've engaged with the Carbon Disclosure Project. Internally, we do our annual streamlined energy carbon reporting, and all of the metrics and the measurements, they go into our accounts for everyone to read. It's within our section 172 statement, I think it is, on our accounts. So it's really important to us that the comments that we make are open to scrutiny and that we're accountable for what we say.
And you can just go back on something. Sorry, Michael, come back to you a second. Just go back to you on something there, Russell, and say, in the UK, it's quite patchy. Do you know, is there any plans to change that?
Not that I'm aware of. I've not heard anything, and I do keep quite close to this. I've not heard anything legislated. I mean, I was aware, and maybe Michael will have more visibility than this on me, but there was talk about taxation being applied to, directly linked to carbon emissions. And I think that's already something that's been mooted in Canada, for example. And I know that has been something that's been discussed almost as whatever your net emissions are, there could be future taxation levied by your respective government. But I'm not sure if Michael's picked that up in Canada.
Sorry, Michael, you want to comment on that area?
Oh, no worries. I'm not sure what's going on in Canada. The US, there's, we deal with carbon offsets all the time, David, and that's part of the tax code. I wanted to add to what Russell was saying, that besides, the ISO standards and the other ones out there are a number of, if not best practices, pretty good practices for measuring ESG efforts. There are a lot of frameworks out there. If you just Google ESG metrics or frameworks or measurements, you'll pull up things like the Global Reporting Initiative, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and these specify ways you can measure your success or your efforts at ESG. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, for example, has standards for ESG for 77 different industries. You shouldn't just go and to try to attack them all as a organization. What you should do is figure out what your goals are, figure out your objectives, and then set create targets for what you want to achieve and why, in what time, and set roadmaps to that. And then measure against qualitative and quantitative methods. And just remember, when you're doing those measurements, it's, you know, good data in, good data out, or garbage in, garbage out. You're not, if you put in suspect data, you're not going to get anything useful. And when I talk about data, it can be anything from power consumption, number of whistleblower complaints, number of data breaches on your system, greenhouse gas emissions, things like that. So there are some good metrics out there, and you want to find obviously you want to comply with the standards, but you want to find the framework that works for you.
It sounds to me that this is certainly an area that needs to be pushed forward. So I suppose I'm going to come back to you both for sort of your final comments on my sort of last question. Is really, as we said in the opening, really, how can the security sector be seen as a sort of champion this area? And I think also one of the things that Michael said earlier that I want to pick up on in that question as well is obviously said one of the areas, certainly in the US, I don't know, I presume it's quite similar in the UK, was because of the diverse nature of the security industry and many sort of smaller organisations. What the larger organisations, or what we can do as a whole security sector can do to sort of bring those smaller bodies on board as well to take this forward. So if I can come to you first, Russell, and then for a couple of minutes, and then I'll come to you, Michael, afterwards.
Yeah, it was interesting, Michael, talking about metrics and measurement, and you know that's something within our own organization. If you want to manage something, you've got to appropriately measure it, first of all, and only by getting a handle on your emissions can you work out, if you are going to be using carbon offset credits, for example, you need to know what the extent of your emissions are. If you can reliably measure, you can successfully offset, in my view. But as I've said already, carbon credits, it's just one tool in the box. It's a good thing for you know, driving a conversation within the organization. People understand what's driving your emissions, and it allows you to focus on the reductions and the development strategy. I listened to an environmental consultant recently at a conference who kind of rubbished the idea of using carbon credits. He said that there was no such thing as carbon neutrality because I'm trying to remember the words that he used specifically, but it was along the lines of, when you eat a burger, it doesn't matter how much salad you have afterwards, you've still eaten the burger. And I challenged him on that, because in my view, if you eat the burger at 600 calories and you jump on an exercise bike and burn 600 calories, I asked him, am I now calorie neutral? He agreed with me. So there is a debate around the use of those, and then there are also integrity concerns around the credits that you can buy on the market, and there are some really credible sources out there. We always acquire ours from the United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change, but there are other standards out there, gold standard. There's verified carbon standards out there as well. But in terms of being able to lead the way and the types of things that, as a security organization or an industry, there are lots of things that I know that, you know, my organization and others are doing around, as I said, paperless reporting, transitioning towards electric vehicles. We found, which is really important, is carbon literacy training amongst our officers and our managers, so that they understand the terminology. They become more carbon aware, and that makes it easy when we're asking security officers to carry out patrols, that they're switching off pre-agreed equipment outside of their normal hours of use. Do we really need heating or air conditioning on a vacant office? Does a photocopier have to remain on standby, you know, overnight? Do we need lighting on in an empty kitchen? But please don't turn off the power to the server room. These things have to be agreed by the client. But yeah, going back to Michael's point, measurement is really important, but there are other measures that can be taken into account to reduce our carbon footprint. Thank
you, Russell. Just to you very quickly, Michael, probably for a minute, if you could just sort of sum up where you think the security sector should be going now.
Sure. My concern is that, and I'm going to get to the where should we go, is that cybersecurity is eclipse physical security. And that while we want to believe that data is invisible, it's maintained in expensive data centers that slurp power for cooling. Data centers collectively draw more energy per year than the entire country of Ireland. So with the explosion of IoT, tech may account for 20% of global energy use by 2030. So that is a very big warning sign or iceberg, but security is doing things well. They're starting with things like the UN Global Compact. What you can do as a security companies leverage partnerships with other organizations to see what they're doing and make sure you're gaining social responsibility across the whole value chain. Prop tech is a good thing to look at. Healthy buildings are a good success story in sustainability. Prop tech combined with security optimizes use of resources, creates efficiencies through the data it generates. So you can use smart sensors to measure room occupancies, power consumption, water usage, thermostat levels, and that sort of thing. To make carbon footprint of shipping and to reduce the carbon footprint of shipping and distribution security. Some products are being made on demand at sites closer to the customer, or they're shipping equipment together instead of piecemeal. Companies are reducing plastics and using recyclables and working with environmentally conscious partners and so on. So those are some of the good things. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, that and these are the things that we should be doing as a profession and industry.
Hey, thank you, Michael. And can I thank both our panelists? We've had a very, very informative session today. And as I say, it's three topics in one there, and we could spend a whole day on just one of those topics, let alone combining all the three together. So thank you very much for covering what you did. Thank you for you, the audience that submitted questions. Still got an odd question that we didn't get a chance to get to. I'll submit those to the panelists and maybe they'll reply to you directly. So where are we now then? Call for nominations. Mentioned about the Oscars, Michael proudly displaying his earlier on. Now we've got call for nominations closing in August and early to mid-September. The Benelux for the Tackling Economic Crime Awards, that's closing on the 8th of August. And then closing at the end of August, Southeast Asia Oscars, the first year for that. September, Australia Oscars on the 1st, and 19th of September for the Canadian Oscars. And this is the last webinar that we're running at the moment. We're going to take a break for the summer. We will be back after the break in the autumn at the beginning of September with a new programme of webinars. So we thank you for attending today, and those of you who've supported us in the past. For those of you celebrating summer, have a lovely summer. If it's winter wherever you're coming from, have a lovely winter, and we look forward to seeing you in September. So once again, thank you to the panelists, thank you to Becky and Shrey in the background here helping me, and as we always say, wherever you are in the world, please stay safe. Thank you.